George Larby, Practice Manager, Governance, World Bank. Ms. Shwetlina Sabarwal, Senior Economist, World Bank, who's looking beautiful in a sari. I'd also like to invite our panelist on stage, Dr. Baikunta Aryal, Secretary, National Natural Resource and Fiscal Commission on stage. I'd also like to invite Dr. Rurik Marsden, Head of Office, DFID, Nepal. And Mr. Faris Haddad Zerbos, Country Manager, Nepal, World Bank. So with the stage all set, with our panelists, our speakers, and our moderator, may I now request our moderator, Ms. Juma, to kindly take over with the proceedings of the session.
Thank you. Thank you and good morning, and welcome to this session on opportunities for human capital investments in federal Nepal. This session is a good segue from the launch of the Nepal Human Development Update that we had this morning, where the importance of investing in human capital and Nepali citizens was emphasized to raise productivity and growth. They also made the interesting point that Nepal can double its GDP if each child was able to reach his or her full potential. We are in this session going to look at how Nepal's development progress was achieved under the unitary system and how we can leverage Nepal's shift to a federal system to improve this, to accelerate this progress through service delivery. We'll start with a short presentation. I'm pleased to introduce my two colleagues from the World Bank, Dr. George Larby. He is the practice manager of the Governance Global Practice. He is responsible for programs on financial accountability and reporting and public sector and institutions in East and South Asia. Prior to this, George worked in the Africa region, and before joining the bank, he was professor at University of Birmingham's School of Public Policy, where he taught for 12 years. And then next to him is Dr. Svetlana Sabarwal. She is senior economist at the World Bank. She is the principal author for the World Development Report 2019 on the changing nature of work, which was discussed in one of the sessions yesterday. She is also a core team member for the bank's Human Capital Index. She was also, by the way, the principal author for the World Development Report last year on education. She holds a PhD in applied economics from the University of Minnesota. So George and Svetlana will share with us the findings of the recent work on the federalism capacity needs assessment and on a recent perception survey in the education sector. So over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. I think this will be a continuation of the discussions we're having in the last session, the launch of the NDU, but also the last session that was moderated by Tekebe. I think I see that as a continuation of those charts. Briefly highlight a few issues, and then I'm sure we'll have a lot of discussions after that. I think we've all known from yesterday and today, that is not new to you, that Nepal made a big shift in this governance structure, moving from a unitary system of government to a federal system of government under the 2015 constitution. So 3 levels of government created: federal, provincial, and local government. And assignment of responsibilities have been done. So we all know that. But what that means is that frontline service delivery shifted more to being the responsibility of the subnational government. And that is very important for human capital development, because talking of education, health, and food and nutrition, water, that became a major responsibility for the subnational government, which is the which is the provincial governments and local governments. We know that all the three levels of government have been in place, especially the new ones at the sub-national level and also the local government level. The 753 local governments and 7 provincial governments have been in place and functioning. Several framework legislations have also been created. So what I want to do is to briefly go through this and see what progress has been made, but also what is the current status, but also what are the challenges that we need to look at. As I already mentioned, the progress being made since 2017 is the election of the subnational governments and all of them being in place, but also the several framework legislations have been put in place. For example, the Intergovernmental Fiscal Arrangements Act, the NNRC Act, and we have the secretary here. We have the several other umbrella legislations always have been put in place. Now, so laws and policies have been put in place to support the transition to federalism. Now, we also know that funds have been transferred from federal to subnational levels. Budgets are being executed. I think within the budget execution, I think we'll come back to that in terms of the challenges that are also being flagged. But in terms of gender, I think Nepal also has been doing very well in terms of mainstreaming gender into its budget. But the current status, we, on the request of the government, the bank and working with other development partners have undertaken what we call a needs assessment. And the needs assessment was carried out to look at and understand better the institutional, organizational, and systemic needs of the provincial and local governments, given their new functions and responsibilities. So we look at their new functions and responsibilities and what is the existing capacity, and to assess what the gaps are, and to identify what the needs are. Now, I don't want to go into the methodology that was adopted, but it was a very cooperative effort between the government, the World Bank, and other development partners to carry out this exercise. The report, a draft report, has been produced and currently being reviewed by the government. So waiting for the feedback from the government before we finalize that. But just to flag a few issues, we're looking at 3 main things: the funds, the functions, and the functionaries. Now, and on the funds, I think the point has already been made about budget execution. And one of the things we realized is that even though the funds have gone to the subnational level, there are challenges in the budget execution. I think this came out in the presentation that was made by Kenny. And then it also came up yesterday. The finance minister also did point that out as a major area of, it remains a challenge, that even though the funds have gone there, the execution rate has been quite low, and there are so many challenges. So critical reforms are needed to strengthen the budget execution systems and the expenditure management. But more importantly, to track how funds are being used. So we are not just talking about funds being transferred, but what the quality of the expenditures that are being made, and whether those expenditures are achieving the service delivery improvements that will be expected. So I think for each of the sectors that we are talking about, health, education, and so on, it would be good to also track the expenditure to see whether it's going to the frontline service delivery within the provinces. So a lot of work needs to be done at the level of public financial management, and strengthen that at the public financial management level. Now, on issues of functions and institutional arrangements, I just want to flag 3 main points. One is the information that subnational governments need in order to plan and prepare their budget. I think that also needs to be improved. But at the level of institutional arrangements, I think three main institutions are important. And making them fully functional, I think, is going to be very important in the implementation of federalism. The first is the Provincial Service, Public Service Commission. This is a body that will be responsible for managing the human resources at the subnational level. It is not fully in place. The commissions have been established, but the laws that need to be put in place, the civil service, federal civil service legislation that will empower these provincial commissions to recruit and hire is not yet in place. So that needs to be in place to enable the provinces and local government to be able to hire to fill the gap and the vacancies that are there and manage the human resources that are there. This is going to be hugely important in managing recruitment, promotions, and so on within the subnational level. The third institution that is very important for implementation is the Interprovincial Council. That council is established by the Constitution, but the regularity, how often it meets, but also the decisions it makes are going to be very, very important. And the inputs of this Provincial Council is going to be important in making the federal system work. Because at a very high level, it is the Prime Minister and the Chief Minister that are members of this council. And how the decisions they make and the commitment they make at that high level is going to be important in getting the political buy-in and the commitment that is needed to implement federalism. In terms of providing high-level policy guidelines, that will be important. The NNRFC, and with the Secretary, Dr. Baikunta here, that secretary is already there. It's been there for a couple of years now. And the system with intergovernmental fiscal transfers is already established. The last March this year, the President appointed the chair to the commission, but the members of the commission are yet to be appointed. So it's not a fully functional commission because we don't have the full members in place. So it's going to be very important to have the full members of that commission appointed. Now, this commission is very important in all countries that are federal systems of government. Even for those that have devolved, like in Kenya, where they established 47 counties, that commission plays a very, very important role. So I think making it functional in terms of revenue allocation and being independent, operationally independent, I think is going to be very, very important to ensure that there is fairness in the distribution of resources across the three levels of government. Talking about functionaries, which is the third F in this, funds and functionaries and functions. I think the functionaries are very important. These are the staff who are needed, the human resources that are needed to make federalism work. The Civil Service Adjustment Act was passed in 2018, and some federal civil servants are supposed to be transferred to the subnational level. But I think there is some hitches in that. And then transferring civil servants to the federal and subnational level is challenging. I think my experience, I was in Kenya when Kenya shifted from devolved, created 47 counties. And it was a huge challenge transferring the staff because some staff were reluctant to be transferred. Some had preferences of where they want to go. And I think Nepal seemed to be going through the same thing. But the main thing is also looking at, okay, when you transfer the staff, there will still be gaps in terms of hiring. And provincial governments may still need to hire to make up the gap in addition to those that are going to be transferred. So the devolution employees, the devolved employees will have to fill the gap, the needs that have been identified within the provinces and local government, but also there are high numbers of vacancies that remain unfilled at the subnational level. Even with the transfers, there's still going to be high numbers of gaps and vacancies to be filled. And I think in the last session, I think it was the former chairman of the National Planning Commission, who mentioned the uneven capacity. The uneven capacity will also reflect on human resource, unevenness of the human resource capacity within the provinces and local governments. So some local government may be highly endowed with human resources, others may not be. And so there may have to be some actions that will have to be taken, incentive to be created to enable people to be willing to work in some provinces and some local governments that people may not want to go to. So some additional incentive may have to be provided to do that. The needs assessment, I think, look at the gaps between what is the staffing that are already there, and but I think I want to move to this last slide, which shows the gap in terms of human resources and staffing. You can see that there's still vacancies when it comes to staffing at the subnational level, and that may explain sometimes why the budget is not fully being executed, because the provinces are still not, if you transfer staff, they have to pay salaries, but they don't have all the full complement of staffing, and so salaries, wage bill may still be very low at the subnational level. And as Kennedy did point out, when the expenditures are fully in place, I think that may add to the budget deficit, but the wage bill may go up slightly once they have a full complement of staff within the provinces and local governments. So I think there are still a lot of things to do when it comes to the functionaries, making sure they are all in place, because they are going to be very, very important for service delivery, health, education, and implementation of provincial and local government policies also. In terms of the key challenges with functionaries, let me go back to the key challenges when it comes to the functionaries, I think. So one of the things we are suggesting to supplement the needs assessment that have been done, because the needs assessment was a very broad assessment of gaps. But there may be a need for very specific, deep analysis of training needs of the various local, provincial governments, local governments, but also within certain areas. Some needs assessment will be done, training needs, so that we can design specific training. Because when we talk of capacity building has to be very specific to something, capacity to do something. And so to do those specific capacity building and training, we may have to do some specific training needs assessment for various provinces in the various areas. And then because the FCNA gives a very broad cover, those specific needs assessment may have to be done. Training needs assessment have to be done. And also to set up the institutional arrangement on how the training is going to be conducted. There's a Nepal Administrative College. I remember in the case of Kenya, it was very chaotic because everybody was doing training. So much duplication on training, development partners were doing training, NGOs were doing training, various governments, institutions were doing training, so the training was not coordinated. But in the end, we managed to convince the government to have a coordinated approach to training. And so we developed a program that everybody then came under the same umbrella of training, so that we are not duplicating the training, we are not spending resources on training that may not be necessary as well. So I think in the case of Nepal, it is important that a comprehensive training program is developed in the various areas. Now, from yesterday, we know that some of the challenges that came up from yesterday's discussion and today, the one word that came out very clearly is the whole of government approach. So how do we adopt that within the federal system of government? How do we coordinate within the federal system of government? I think the last panel discussion highlighted this. The horizontal coordination and the vertical coordination is going to be very important. And coordination is a major issue in every government, where ministries don't talk to each other, but the vertical is going to be important. I thought the IPC is going to be very important for coordination, the vertical coordination to work, that the IPC being more regularity of meeting and their direction is going to be very important for the coordination. of implementation of federalism. Let me, in terms of forward-looking in terms of what we are proposing based on the needs assessment, and we're also working on some kind of policy note that can help the government prepare a roadmap for implementation of federalism. And one of the things we have suggested is for a roadmap to be prepared for implementation of federalism, and this roadmap would then sequence the various actions that need to be taken for implementation of federalism. And then we also suggest that the IPC has to be strengthened. The IPC, which is the Prime Minister's office and the chief ministers, may need some supporting functions to work. I did work in Nigeria, which is one of the big federations in Africa, and I know that in the case of Nigeria, this similar body has a secretariat, and the secretariat is staffed with professional staff in various fields, who then advise the IPC equivalent in terms of policy areas, technical areas, following up. So that kind of structure may be needed to support the IPC as well. But also, I think they need to complete the legal framework that empowers the provincial and local governments to adequately deliver and manage services. I did point out the public service commissions at the provincial level have been created, but the law that needs to be enacted to enable them recruit and play their role is yet to be made effective. I hear it's being reviewed, but once that law is being effective, then it gives the provincial civil service commissions the ability to perform their functions and carry out their mandate. I already mentioned the training needs assessment. That needs to be done, specific training needs assessment, and then the adoption of national provincial training and capacity building plans. And then making the institutional arrangement for this training to happen. The Nepal Administrative College can help them develop the modules for the training of various areas: procurement, financial management, M&E, human resource management. These are areas that training needs will have to be done, and specific modules prepared to help develop the capacity that will be needed. One other point is the clarification of the service delivery responsibilities for the concurrent functions. The Constitution gives service delivery as a concurrent responsibility of federal and subnational government, which is the province and local government. Now, this is okay, but I think the clarification is needed about what will be the specific role for each level of government when it comes to service delivery, because I think the last session did point out the risk of service failure. And part of the risk of service failure is things falling through the cracks, where each level of government thinks that the other level will be responsible and nothing happens. But the other risk of service failure also have to come with the staffing that is needed to be able to deliver the services.
George, I'm mindful that we're falling a little bit behind schedule,
okay.
so can we wrap up?
So I think, just to conclude, the importance of coordination, the importance of implementation, and the whole of government approach is going to be important to implement federalism, especially in relation to human capital. These three things are going to be very, very important. So let me just stop here, and then I think the next colleague will go drill down into education to bring some of this to a sector level. Thank you.
So I was so excited to wear a sari, and now I'm worried I'll trip. So I hope that doesn't happen. Okay, so how does a country focus on the big objectives when everything is changing, right? Everything is changing. So that is the situation in which Nepal is today. And I'm going to speak on behalf of the World Bank education team, which has done some work to look at where are the risks and where are the opportunities that Nepal can really grasp, right? Because if Nepal grasps the opportunities and avoids the risk, then human capital outcomes can really improve in the short run for the next generation. But if it doesn't do that, then there is a risk that the human capital for these children who are currently in schools is going to be compromised, right? So what does Nepal do? The first thing that Nepal should do is to think about the big picture, right? Why is it that we embarked on federalism? And Nepal is doing that already. So we found two pieces of really good news at the field level, in schools, among frontline service providers. The first piece of good news is optimism. And the second piece of good news is a really strong sense of prioritization, okay? So nearly all the head teachers and teachers that we spoke with are really optimistic that federalism will improve education. It will actually improve education. And why do they feel this way? They feel this way for one major reason. They believe that with federalism, they will be heard, that they will be able to impact the decisions that will impact them, right? And that is the big source from which this optimism is coming. We also asked local leaders, so we interviewed about 200 local leaders from across the country, and we asked them about their priorities. And nearly 3/4 of them put education and health at the very top. So this is, they prioritized education and health over things like electricity, roads, infrastructure, private sector development. So they had a real sense of wanting to focus on human capital. Okay? So I think it's these are where the opportunities are, right? The strong sense of optimism and the strong sense of prioritization. The second thing Nepal needs to do is identify the risks, right? Both the immediate risks and also the somewhat short-term, medium-term risks. So here we found three big things. There are three big risks: capacity risks, the risk of confusion, and politics. Okay? So very quickly, So we've all talked about the capacity risk. I think the government of Nepal is really conscious about it. I think a lot is being done and planned. But to give you a real sense of what it looks like at the field level, remember how most local leaders prioritize education? Not only that, they want to spend more on education than has been spent in the past. And yet, 33% of local leaders had not even heard about the school sector development plan, which is the government of Nepal's flagship education program, right? So despite their best intentions, it's going to be hard for these local leaders to really improve education if they don't know what the status quo is, if they don't know what programs and policies are in place. And this fear is really shared by head teachers who are worried that these local leaders don't have the technical expertise to really govern service delivery, right? And so this is a real fear at the field level. But there's also good news. So not only are local leaders open to capacity building, they are eager for it. So we did this small experiment where we asked one set of local leaders whether they prefer the center to build their capacity. And we asked another group whether they want center to help them build their own capacity. Okay? And local leaders were significantly more likely to say they just want the center to come and build their capacity. Now, this might not seem like a big result, but for somebody who has looked at decentralization in different countries, this is unusual. So usually what happens is that local governments exhibit some level of distrust with the center. But in Nepal, perhaps because this is the beginning and things have happened with great momentum, there is a lot of trust that local leaders are showing towards the center, especially when it comes to technical issues. And so it's very important for the center to deliver on this promise, right? And local leaders have also expressed very clear ideas of where they want capacity building to happen first. So they identified three areas. planning, budgeting, and teacher supervision. And the fantastic thing is that this list is very similar to the list that head teachers and teachers gave us about where local leaders should get capacity building first. So there's a lot of desire, eagerness, and clarity on how capacity building can get started. Okay, now confusion. So I don't need to talk about this much. I think George has already, I don't know what's happening with this. George has already talked about, why there may be confusion. But again, I want to give you an example of what it looks like at the field level. Okay? So we asked people, who should be responsible for teachers? All right? So now here I'm talking about elected local leaders, right? So 73% of elected local leaders felt that local governments should be responsible for promoting teachers. 55% felt that local governments should be responsible for hiring teachers. Okay? And look at how the numbers look when we ask the same question to head teachers. Only 35% feel that local governments should in fact promote teachers, and only 16% feel that local governments should hire teachers. So this is dramatic. This is the difference between majority and less than 50%, right? So what does this confusion do, right? Obviously, it leads to paralysis, right? So people don't know who's responsible for what, and things don't get done. But it can also lead to a deeper problem. It can lead to tensions between different actors in the chain. Because if expectations are set, then these expectations not being met can lead to a feeling of letdown, resentment, pushback, and so on. And the other problem is that when capacity gaps and confusion combine, they create like a bigger problem than you had just with these alone, right? Capacity plus confusion, capacity gaps plus confusion is like a very terrible formula. So in the study that George was mentioning, when people were asked about disruption of education services, nearly 70% feel that that's already happening because of staff shortages. Similarly, not only are these gaps in understanding happening in teacher management, they're also happening for very basic things like textbooks, examinations, and so on. Okay, so the third risk is politics. So now, obviously with federalism, the politics of education has completely changed. And that's not a bad thing, right? So when people are so optimistic that they will be heard, it's because they know local governments need to be re-elected. So that's not a bad thing. But what it also means is that local governments might prioritize political considerations over technical needs. And head teachers and teachers are very worried about this. So one example we are seeing is that a lot of local governments are quickly declaring their local governments as being free of out-of-school children. So they're claiming that their local governments have no out-of-school children. Now we know that that's actually not possible. Almost all local governments do have some children out of school in the ages of 5 and 15, and the technical best thing to do is to really accept it, be very careful in reporting the numbers, and then trying to find policies and measures to bring them in. But the political pressure is to actually say, actually, we don't have any out-of-school children. So that's the kind of problem I'm talking about. The other issue is that head teachers and teachers are worried that these local governments are not going to care about marginalized students. And this concern really came out very strongly in Lalitpur, where there are a lot of immigrant children. Okay, so what to do? Now, my sense, and the sense from this study, is that the way Nepal should think about protecting and even promoting human capital is to think about immediate actions and then some more short-term actions. And in the bucket of immediate actions is the point that George made, which is clarify the roles and responsibilities for concurrent functions. That is extremely important. And once those are clarified, communicate them to the local governments. In parallel, build capacity, especially in the areas where local governments are very eager to get capacity building. In fact, you could combine the two, right? So you could smuggle in a lot of important information provision through capacity building and give them a real sense of roles and responsibilities and also reporting, both reporting from down up, reporting from up down. Now, in terms of the short term, the lesson from all the global evidence again and again is that decentralization succeeds when there are good systems of information and accountability in place. And here, I'm going to leave you with really good news. Local leaders are very supportive of both information and accountability platforms. So they are very supportive of the idea of reporting things like teacher absenteeism and learning outcomes to the public, and this will be very good in having the public hold local governments accountable and also make it easier for the center to track and support service delivery. They're also very open to community meetings, audits, reporting of expenditure, and so on. So there is a lot of openness and support, but the important thing is to communicate and build on these positive sentiments as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Svetlana and George, for that insightful presentation. So we see that federalism now is the new reality in Nepal, and we often hear the number 753 plus 7 plus 1 unit of governments. We heard from the presentation that a lot of progress has been made in the areas of funds, functions, and functionaries, the key pillars under federalism. And we also heard that expectations are high. But we also heard about the risks of disruption to service delivery because of undefined roles, local political economy, and weak capacity. So I'm pleased to now introduce to you our three distinguished panelists who will share with us some of their thoughts on these important issues. Third to my left is Dr. Baikunta Aryal, who doesn't need introduction to this crowd, but he is the secretary at the National Natural Resources and Fiscal Commission and a key driver of the resource allocation framework, which is critical for subnational governments to perform their functions. Dr. Aryal's career spans over 25 years in civil service with important contributions to the Office of the Prime Minister, Council of Ministers, and the Ministry of Finance. He holds a PhD in resource economics from Norwegian University of Life Sciences. And next to Dr. Aryal is Fares Haddad Servos, World Bank Country Manager for Nepal. Prior to this, Fares was country manager in Malaysia as well as in Bolivia. In his bank career, he has served as head of mission for Iraq and operations manager for the West Bank and Gaza. Fares holds a master's in economics from George Mason University and a master's in finance from George Washington University. And next to Fares, last but not least, Rurik Marsden. He's the head of the UK Department for International Development in Nepal. He has also worked for DFID in Myanmar and in South Sudan, and with the UK delegation to the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Before coming to Nepal, Rurik, he was DFID's Research and Evidence Division, he was there as Deputy Director. He studied at Cambridge and Sheffield Universities and at the LSE. So, let's start with you, Dr. Aryal, and your reactions to the presentation. What is your own assessment on the progress to the transition to federalism so far and the impact on services? Where do you see the gaps, and how would you go about addressing them?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sharon. Both the presenters, yeah, you did the job very well. Good one. I mean, both the presentations, I believe, were based on the surveys that we carried out some time ago. One is the federalism capacity needs assessment survey, and another one is the perception survey, how the people feel like. I agree with most of the things, not with all, but most of the things about what you have presented. You rightly pointed out, to sustain the federalism and to strengthen it and to make it work in Nepal, in the present context, we need 3F plus C. That's what we have been calling. Not only 3F, that's functions, functionaries, and funds, but again, plus C is capacity. And that's why, with the Nepal government's request, the bank carried out the FCNA. You rightly pointed out about the positive outcomes of the overall survey, how the things were and what are the what are the weaknesses in the smooth functioning of the federalism. That's fine. And I also appreciate the data that you presented about 8 months data, how the provincial governments are working with the expenditure, whether they are doing good or relatively okay or even weak or poor. I agree with most of the data over there, and you also try to segregate the total expenditure in terms of capital expenditure as well as in the recurrent expenditure. Given the strength and given the functionaries, very well-established functionaries in the provincial government, the way that they have been doing in these first 8 months of this fiscal year, it's not that bad, I should say. Because, the functionaries are not set well, and your subsequent slides were showing that still most of them are having huge deficiency in the civil servants and all this. And again, lack of some of the regulations, institutional mechanisms, and all those things, the provincial governments, we cannot expect them to work at 100% at this first year. And this is the first year for them to establish everything, establish the norms, establish the mechanisms, establish the institutions, and then again make them work. And so I'm not surprised with the data that you provided. And as Svetlana was presenting afterwards, I also do have some optimism about whatever. And whatever they have been doing so far, I'm a bit optimistic. Let me go to the presentation. The first presentation, one small correction over there. So far, this Interprovincial Council meeting we had held, it has been held twice, not only once. So 2 meetings are already over there. And one meeting was very focused on the budget preparation for next fiscal year. And that helped the federal government to make the budget more federal friendly and federalism friendly. And then again, the provincial governments to make their budget in line with the national priorities and programs and all the things. That's what I believe. Okay, now about the overall this functionaries thing. I will spend a little bit more time on the functionaries. Functionaries, I don't only mean with the civil servants. You showed the data about how the insufficiency of the civil servants are over there in the provincial government and the local government. But the very clear understanding of what they are supposed to do is the basic thing for the functionaries to function. Only you have the chunk of people, the assembly of the people over there. But again, if they don't know what to do, then it's very, very difficult. And then not only what to do, but how to do is the major problem. You rightly pointed out that the clarification on the concurrent list should be there. I also see that not only the concurrent functions, but also this exclusive function of the federal and provincial and local governments should be very clear of. Because some of the functions listed in the exclusive list of the different tiers of the government, they cannot be implemented without the help of other governments, and so that is also needed. So whether you grasp those things during your survey or not, I don't know. And strengthening the IPC is very, very good idea. But one thing I do not agree with, I agree, performance evaluation of the SNGs are needed, it's needed. It has to be for the federal governments too. Because federal government is also habituated with the unitary governance system mechanism, not the federal system mechanism and so. So capacity at the federal level is also needed. That's what I believe. Because what I see in this first year of the implementation of the federalism, I see a lot of confusions in the federal governments too. Sometimes some functions were assigned to the subnational governments and then again brought back to the federal. And then again some of the provincial governments, they requested the federal government to bring those functions to back to them or back to the federal governments and all this. So there should be clear, a kind of capacity building, capacity development at all levels of the things. With the education, I thought, because of the name of this, theme of this forum, I also get to know something about the health. But health is missing over here. But education, that's good. And one more thing, whether you asked to them or not, because the confusion, you rightly pointed out about the responsibility, whose responsibility, whether federal government's responsibility, provincial government's responsibility, local government, but what are the responsibilities of the teachers themselves? Because, they were recruited under one system. Now they are going to be, they're working in another system. So that is one very clear message that I wanted to know from these things, but again, I didn't find. And one more thing that I'm running out of time, I believe. Preference for top-down approach for the training is often, I also felt. That's what I was also interacting with the people in the subnational government, and they also preferred that one, but cannot be always. So whether we can have some kind of mechanisms at the provincial level to make these trainings and capacity building at the provincial level, at least, so that it can be decentralized and the more result-oriented. I stop here, and I'll come back again if time permits. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Arya. I think your point that we are still only at the one-year mark after the start of federalism is point well taken. Ruri, can we get your reaction? What are your own observations on the prospects for improved service delivery based on what you have seen and heard through your work this past year?
Okay, so thank you very much, and I'd like to kind of thank everybody for the presentations as well. I think there's lots of really interesting stuff there, which definitely merits discussion. I guess as a development partner, the UK focuses a lot on health, so maybe I could try and kind of think about some of the perspectives from that, and also building on the really important points that the Health Secretary made in the previous session. It feels to me as if there's almost a way of thinking about the 3 Fs plus C plus CD. And I won't talk much more about the 3 Fs, because I think that's been covered a lot in the presentations. But I think there's something really important about coordination, and there's something really important about data that it's worth reflecting on at this point. When you look at the kind of data we see from how people are feeling, there is a really strong sense of optimism. There was a recent survey, they talked to 12,000 people. I think about 80% of people were saying they felt optimistic about the future, and that's really important. So there are definitely expectations. People hope stuff was going to get better, but there's a strong sense that this is an agenda which is important to try. So in terms of coordination, it's really interesting when you look at the how local governments are using data in the health sector. So kind of our sense is that about 8 in 10 local governments are using some sort of process to monitor performance in health. But when you ask them about that process, only about 3 in 10 feel that they have the capacity to really do it seriously, and about 4 in 10 feel that they have the know-how to do it seriously. So there's a really important challenge in making sure that there is data available for people to make good decisions and understand the impact of their decisions. And when you look at the broader collection, it feels as if there is data coming from, maybe sort of half or so of local governments, and that for about half of the data that is available, there's questions about the quality. If you do annealing tests on the data, not all of it is necessarily reflecting the reality on the ground. So there's a really important agenda in terms of making sure that we are able to strengthen management information systems in ways that reflect the roles and responsibilities set out in the Constitution, but ensure that there is a systematic collection of data, quality data, standardized data, that local governments and the provincial governments and federal governments can use for decision making, use to identify problems, use to address key issues. And I think here, coming back to what the Health Secretary was talking about earlier, I think this question of the health assemblies, how do you build common understanding across the spheres of government about agendas, and how do you manage issues about resource allocation? There are limited resources available, and it's really important to allocate them in an effective way. And if every local government makes its own allocation decisions, there are going to be externalities that need to be managed. I mean, if everybody's got a hospital all the way along a road, that's not necessarily the most efficient allocation. And there needs to be a space for having a rational discussion about how do you manage those externalities? How do you get a sensible allocation of resources that delivers best for people? So I think those two issues, data and thinking about coordination, are both critical. And I think in terms of, as a development partner, we're also really focused on this idea of capacity building. So we're very, very keen on the discussion that's been going on about the provincial and local government support program, which is a government-led program, but which hopefully would be based on provincial and local ownership. So managing this tension between bottom-up and top-down, and allowing the provinces and the local governments to have a strong role in setting the priorities for capacity building, but within an overall framework. And we very much hope that those ideas are concluded, and there's a kind of a process starts soon to support capacity building at the subnational level. Allied to that, I think in the health sector, we're very focused on the need for us to change the way we've been delivering our programming, and to move to working with all three spheres of government. So I think, Baikantha was talking about the importance of federal government and federal government changing. I think we think that's really critical. We think it's really important to be working with federal government on setting the kind of spheres of expectation, the quality expectations, but then working with provincial and local governments on the delivery and how delivery will work in the future. And that's how we're thinking about how we probably need to change the way that we deliver our programming. And I suppose the fundamental thing is that we want to help ensure that programming matches preferences, and that's going to be about the proper decision-making processes, deliberative decision-making processes, reflection on the data, and access to quality data about what's working and what's not. So, yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Rurik, for emphasizing those important points on robust data and coordination at all levels. Now, Faris, before I turn to you, I want to give a chance to the audience to ask a question, because I feel we have been dominating the discussion here on stage. So is there anyone from the audience who has a burning question for any of our panelists or even presenters? No questions? Okay. Faris, we're back to you.
Thank you, Serene.
Okay. Yesterday, we heard from the NPC Joint Secretary that local governments have been focusing on physical infrastructure to respond to the voters. So I wanted to get your views. In a country like Nepal, where we know there's a huge infrastructure deficit, and where the human capital potential is less than half of what it could be, where would you invest your limited resources?
Thank you very much, Serene. So just trying to bring back, I mean, obviously this was very, very useful, and it's a bit difficult to come and answer this after Dr. Baikunta and Rurik, just because, you know, I think we work very closely together, so we tend to have an alignment of views over time. We're starting to sort of sound like each other, so I would fully agree and support with their opinions. So I'll try to, in the interest of time, I think there's so many bank folks on the panel, so I'll speak very shortly because I'm sure others want to hear other views, so I'd like to give my colleagues more time. So I'll add a little bit to that. I think one is obviously bringing back the discussion to the issue of human capital. So this is a very interesting discussion, and obviously agree with everything, but this refers to public service delivery at large, and that's certainly true for human capital, but also true for public service delivery. So everything we've been saying is about, you know, is a truism and a universal truth at this point, a point in Nepal on what needs to happen. Now, bringing it back to human capital, and I'm really overly summarizing this, but basically the principle of human capital is, you know, basically it's a holistic storyline, it's a holistic view that looks at survival rates, health, access to education. I would argue even beyond that, issues of dignity, self-realization. So an investment in a productive and self-fulfilled citizen of the future requires a multivariate investment at very early prenatal, natal, neonatal investments all the way to adulthood. And that's what creates a thing. So it's looking at it from health education. So insofar as that, you know, that is the objective in Nepal, and we've agreed, and the Minister of Finance himself was very articulate yesterday. He said for Nepal to develop, we have a production function that has various variables. One of them is physical infrastructure and the other is human infrastructure. So I think the first answer to your question is, and we all agree on this, is it has to be invested in equal proportion. The good thing about human infrastructure, it does not really rust. The machinery does not decay, but it self-propagates if properly invested in. And at the same time, it creates its own infrastructure. So it's obviously a very intelligent machine that actually self-propagates. So the returns from investments in human infrastructure actually have externalities for other types of investments. So we need to invest in that. And it goes without saying. Has Nepal fulfilled its investment in both physical and human infrastructure? We would all agree it has not. And there have been some constraints to that at a number of levels. Now, looking at Nepal's storyline, this is a country that has been historically beset by a number of exogenous shocks, whether they're physical, political, geographic, conflict-related. The reality is they have. For the first time, certainly in a long time, we have a window of opportunity that is very positive and optimistic now to reverse these trends with a government with some degree of long-term horizon and predictability. So now is the time to sort of set the storyline for human capital development. To do that, I think we need to look at it at infrastructure and we have another huge positive shock, which is a new constitution, new rules of the game, and a new federalism context. So the lay of the land, the architecture has completely changed. So we agree, one, we need to invest in infrastructure, and we should view all of it as one infrastructure, concomitant investments in human and physical, and they both feed into each other. So what are the 4 or 5 things that I think we as an institution, if I could speak for the World Bank, need to invest in, and this overlaps? We're looking at it purely from the human capital side. One, you look at it at the x-axis and the y-axis. X-axis is functionality, let's say, across the different sectors. So health, education, social protection. I would go even beyond human capital indicator, labor markets, other issues, etc. On the y-axis, the 3 tiers of government, which are now jointly and severally required to actually invest and provide public services. So I would say there's a few. One is to get the storyline straight. I think that it is still important to make sure all policymakers at all levels are fully on board with the fact that to create the future young lady of Nepal who is 100% productive 25 years from now, investments has to happen across 3 of them. This has to be something that is a storyline that we need to work and develop, and has to be a multivariate approach that everybody agrees in. Once we do that, then policies, practices, regulations, the role of the respected Secretary for Health, Education, Social Protection would work together towards this. And then we need to see a multi-sectoral response to invest in early years and childhood. So I think we have to see that in the practice, in the budgeting that Dr. Katiwada does, and everything, and even the budgeting to be linked to human capital rather than specific inputs. That's one. And the issue of data. So Rurik, so that's one. So common storyline. The second one is data. But I would argue, I mean, Rurik is entirely right, and I fully agree, but I think that data is necessary but insufficient nature of the problem. It's data institutions. I would actually argue that it is true that there's a dearth of data, there's a lack of data, but insofar as there is data, and we've been talking about this yesterday, and there's massive amount of big data that happens in Nepal, what do institutions do in Nepal to process the data into something meaningful? Certainly for public sector delivery, private sector response, civil society, do they interact these different institutions of data to produce optimal results? And this is something we need to look into that. What that means on the next day is how do we target resources? Dr. Baikunta's work, how does he have the proper formulas and data to inform where the equalization grant and others would be going in a dynamic way? Establishing a social registry with demographic and socioeconomic data to better target programs is another issue. So I think, you know, interoperability amongst information system, the cash transfer beneficiary database, scholarship database on poor households. So the issue is we need to start developing ecosystems for data, not focus only on the data, and that will allow. And last but not least, infrastructure, human and physical, and then I'll stop, Serene. Let us remember that capacity building for the central, I fully agree with Baikunta and the local levels, is absolutely critical, because at the end of the day, how much do you hope to achieve if we're looking, even the best performing sort of a province, and I won't name it, actually managed to execute 10.4% of its capital expenditures, and the federal government 28.8, maybe you could argue it's 38.8, whatever, but it's still very low. So capacity building for execution of policies and projects has to be blind to human capital infrastructure. It has to be focusing on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Faris, for also highlighting that it's not an either-or issue. Both human and physical investments are important. And then bringing us back to the issue of capacity, both at the federal and local government levels. So I'm mindful that we're a little bit behind time, but I do want to open this up to the audience once again before we wrap up. Any questions for our panelists or presenters? No? People are feeling hungry before lunch. Okay, so Dr. Aryal, I want to wrap up with a forward look from you. If we were to look down the road 5 years from now, what would you like local government spending to focus on? And keeping in mind that this is ultimately their decision, but what would you do to influence that?
Okay, thank you, Sharon. Thank you, the panelists. You raised some good issues, and Rurik actually tried to complicate my formula. I only had this 3F plus C. Now he made it 3F plus 2C plus D, right? Plus D. So it's a kind of complicated formula that he tried to do. Thank you very much. I mean, I fully agree with that. Data is needed. Sharon, your question regarding the forward-looking. My concern is also with the data. Data in terms of not only the head count data or all these things, but I need some kind of standardization of the work. What standards that the federal government or the provincial government or the local government set for different kind of services, or even for the infrastructure, which is key for the fiscal equalization grant. Without the standards, then we cannot make, the very robust type of formula for the fiscal equalization grant. The standards in terms of if we take the example of road, then what road density that each local governments had to have over there. And if the education, what is the quality? And what are the basic things about retention of the students? And again, ensuring that the child who is enrolled in the first grade in this year will be passing the high school in 12 years' time or something. So what type of standards that we make it? And that I convert into the data, and then I can just assign some weightage against it and then provide the robust formula for fund allocation. So that is very, very key. And the local governments and the provincial governments, what should they do? I mean, their ultimate decisions that you said. The constitution is very clear. I mean, it's clear in terms of the roles of different tiers of the government. For the federal government, it says that, I mean, the federal government should be engaged in the policy making, regulation, and mega projects of the physical or social infrastructure. The provincial governments are key in the development activities, all type of physical infrastructure and some other infrastructure too. And local governments, as the presenters in the beginning pointed out very rightly, that I mean, they are closest to the people, so they have the key role in service delivery. So they should be focusing on their own role rather than going to everywhere and trying to do everything. Neither federal government, nor the provincial government, nor the local governments, they should, I mean, they try to encroach each other's jurisdiction. If they focus and concentrate on their own jurisdictions, and that's easier for us to make the formula right, and then make the financial assignment a bit more robustly, so that everything will go smooth. That's the thing. And if that can happen, and we will also talk to the federal ministries in the center, so that they can also help to set the standards for each and every activities and each and every outcomes over there.
Thank you very much for your concluding thoughts. I'm glad that we at least came up with a new formula now for federalism, the 3 Fs, 2 Cs, and 1 D. So with this, okay, so this brings us to the conclusion of this session. I'd like to thank our panelists, presenters, and the audience for holding up so well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our moderator, to our speakers and our panelists for the lovely session on opportunities for human capital investment in federal Nepal. We now have lunch break for 45 minutes, so I hope to see everyone by 1 o'clock so that we can at least start the next session on time. And the next session is on tackling human capital inequality. So once again, thanking the delegates for this session. I'd like to announce that we now have a lunch break. I hope to see you all after the lunch break more energized and ready for the next session. Thank you very much.